A racist white principal targets a black teacher because he believes that she is not qualified to teach white students. He is enraged when the black teacher pushes back and gets justice. Aaliyah Daniels adjusted the strap of her bag as she walked through the main doors of Glendale High School. The first day of a new semester always brought a mix of excitement and nervous energy. But this year, something felt different. Whispers of change had been circulating in the staff room for weeks, ever since the announcement of the new principal's arrival. Aaliyah, a dedicated English teacher, had heard little beyond his name, Mr. Richard Kavanaugh. The staff meeting that morning buzzed with cautious optimism. Teachers gathered in clusters, trading their summer stories and speculations about the new leadership. Aaliyah found her seat near the back, preferring to observe. When Richard entered, the room stilled. He was tall, with a polished suit, and a confident air that bordered on arrogance. His smile was sharp, and his eyes scanned the room like he was taking inventory. "Good morning," he began, his voice commanding but smooth. "I'm excited to join Glendale High and to help you all uphold the standards of excellence this school is known for." His introduction was standard, but Aaliyah couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered when it reached her. She straightened her back, willing herself to remain neutral under his scrutiny. As the meeting concluded, Richard approached her with a broad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're Ms. Daniels, right?" he asked, his tone cordial but laced with something unspoken. "Yes, that's me," she replied, extending her hand. He hesitated before shaking it. "I don't see many of your kind in teaching roles." "It's refreshing." Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She managed a polite smile, unwilling to let the comment unsettle her in front of her colleagues. "I'm passionate about what I do. My students matter to me." "I'm sure they do," he said, his grin widening. "Well, we'll see how things go this semester. I like to challenge my staff." With that, he moved on, leaving Aaliyah rooted to the spot. The casual remark clung to her, its implications undeniable. As the day unfolded, her unease deepened when she noticed subtle changes. Her schedule filled with the most challenging students, while others received hand-picked groups of high achievers. The semester had just begun, but Aaliyah already felt the weight of an uphill battle. The bell rang, marking the start of the day, but Aaliyah Daniels struggled to focus as she scanned her newly updated class rosters. The names were unfamiliar, which wasn't unusual at the start of a semester, but what caught her attention was the glaring imbalance. Nearly every student assigned to her had a history of behavioral challenges or academic struggles. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from a colleague. "Hey, noticed Kavanaugh moved your advanced kids to Mr. Larson." "What's up with that?" Aaliyah's chest tightened. Mr. Larson, one of the senior teachers, was known for openly praising easy students. The thought of her carefully nurtured relationships with those students being disregarded left her frustrated. She shot a polite reply, suppressing the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Later, during the staff lunch break, Aaliyah approached Principal Kavanaugh's office. She took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," his voice boomed. As she stepped inside, she was met with his rehearsed smile. "Ms. Daniels, what can I do for you?" "Good afternoon, Mr. Kavanaugh," she began, her voice steady. "I wanted to discuss my class assignments. It seems there's been some reshuffling. I'd like to understand the reasoning behind the changes." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands behind his head. "Ah, yes. I did make a few adjustments. Your previous roster didn't seem suitable for your teaching style." Her brow furrowed. "I've worked with both advanced and struggling students in the past. I don't see why there'd be an issue." His smile tightened. "Let's call it a strategic decision. I believe in playing to people's strengths. I assumed you'd be more comfortable with these students." "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, her frustration breaking through. "Relax, Ms. Daniels," he replied, his tone laced with condescension. "It's nothing personal. Some of us just have a natural knack for handling certain challenges. Let's leave it at that, shall we?" Aaliyah left the office feeling dismissed and insulted. But she wasn't the type to back down. Determined to show her worth, She poured her energy into her students. The first week tested her patience, as she found herself breaking up fights, chasing down incomplete assignments, and offering emotional support to teenagers who had all but given up on themselves. Her colleagues, meanwhile, seemed to thrive. During a faculty meeting, she overheard Mr. Larson joking about how easy his classes were this year. The knot in her stomach tightened, but she forced a smile, unwilling to let anyone see her frustration. The breaking point came a week later when Richard made another pointed comment during a lunchroom discussion about student engagement. "Well, some teachers just aren't cut out for advanced classes," he said, glancing in her direction. The other staff members chuckled nervously, unwilling to challenge him. Aaliyah stared at him, her fork frozen in midair. She wanted to respond, to call him out, but the risk was too great. She needed this job, and she couldn't afford to give him a reason to target her further. Instead, she returned to her classroom, shutting the door to keep the world out. That evening, Aaliyah sat at her dining table, her head in her hands. She thought about the students she'd lost, the ones who had flourished under her care. She thought about the students she now had, many of whom came to class angry or defeated. She thought about Richard's smirk, his condescending tone, and the way he had made her feel powerless. She picked up her phone and called her sister. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Don't let him win," her sister replied firmly. "You've always fought for what's right. This is no different. You just have to figure out how to fight smart." The words stayed with Aaliyah as she prepared for bed that night. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Richard push her out. The next day, she walked into the school with her head held high. Her students needed her, and she wasn't about to let them, or herself, down. Aaliyah Daniels had barely finished her morning attendance when the intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Daniels, please report to my office immediately," came Richard Kavanaugh's voice. Her chest tightened. The tone of his summons carried no pretense of professionalism, only smug authority. She glanced at her students, offering a calm smile before stepping into the hallway. Inside his office, Richard didn't bother to mask his disdain. He gestured to a chair without looking up from the papers on his desk. "Ms. Daniels," he began, finally glancing up, "we need to talk about your classroom performance." She frowned. "My performance? Could you clarify?" He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I've had several complaints from students and parents about the environment in your classroom. Apparently, some of your methods are intimidating." "Intimidating?" Aaliyah asked, her voice even despite the insult. "Don't take it personally," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Sometimes certain teachers struggle to connect with their students. It's just not natural for everyone." Aaliyah clenched her fists under the desk. She knew what he was implying, but refused to give him the satisfaction of reacting. "I've always prioritized creating a safe, productive space for my students. If there's specific feedback, I'd appreciate hearing it." "Oh, don't worry," Richard said with a chuckle. "I'll be keeping a close eye on your classroom. If I don't see improvement, we may need to reconsider your placement here." She left his office feeling a familiar wave of anger and frustration. His casual racism was growing bolder, and it was clear he wanted her gone. The situation worsened in the weeks that followed. Richard continued to make pointed remarks during staff meetings, often directing them at Aaliyah. "Some teachers don't understand the importance of discipline," he said one afternoon, his eyes fixed on her, especially when they come from, let's say, less rigorous backgrounds. Her colleagues remained silent, their discomfort evident, but no one dared challenge him. In the lunchroom, he made no effort to hide his disdain. "Back in my day, teachers were expected to set an example. Now, well, let's just say standards have changed. Drastically." Each comment chipped away at Aaliyah's composure. Still, she held her head high, refusing to let him see her break. The final straw came during a one-on-one meeting about student progress. "You know," Richard said, leaning forward with a smirk, "I've been wondering how someone like you ended up here. Teaching at a school like Glendale must be quite the leap." "Someone like me?" Aaliyah asked, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. "Come on," he replied, feigning innocence. "You know what I mean. It's rare to see someone from your background in a place like this. I'm sure it must feel overwhelming." "Overwhelming," she repeated, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He shrugged. "It's not your fault. Some people just aren't cut out for this level of professionalism. You're trying, though, and I can respect that. Just don't get too ambitious." The venom in his words was undeniable. Aaliyah felt the blood rush to her face, but she kept her composure. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "I think this conversation is over," she said, standing abruptly. "Oh, I'm not done," Richard replied, his smile fading. "You need to understand something, Ms. Daniels. I'm in charge here. If you think anyone will believe your complaints, think again. You're lucky to even have this job, and if you keep pushing, I'll make sure it's the last one you ever get." Aaliyah stared at him, her heart pounding. The threat hung in the air, like a storm cloud. For the first time, she considered quitting. That night, she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as tears streamed down her face. She had fought so hard to build her career, to make a difference for her students, and now it felt like it was slipping away. But as the tears dried, a new emotion took hold: determination. She refused to let Richard win. He had underestimated her, but she would not be silenced. The next day, Aaliyah began planning. She knew she couldn't fight him directly, but there had to be a way to expose his behavior. She thought about the superintendent, James Carter, and the possibility of finding an ally. For now, she focused on collecting evidence. She needed proof of Richard's racism, clear, undeniable proof that would force action. As she walked into the school that morning, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Richard might be powerful, but he wasn't invincible. Aaliyah Daniels sat at her desk during her lunch break, staring at the piles of unfinished assignments from her students. Each paper was a reminder of the near-impossible task Richard Kavanaugh had set for her. As she reached for her pen, her email notification pinged. Opening the message, she froze. It was from a parent, criticizing her teaching methods and questioning whether she was qualified to handle their child's education. Her heart sank as she read the words. The tone was scathing, filled with assumptions and coded language that mirrored Richard's remarks. It was no coincidence. The parent mentioned a concerned conversation with the principal. Aaliyah clenched her jaw. She was being set up, and it was clear Richard had been spreading his narrative about her to the community. She closed the email, her hands trembling with frustration. The idea of quitting crept into her mind again, but before she could entertain it, a knock on her classroom door interrupted her thoughts. It was her colleague, Ms. Harper, a history teacher, and one of the few staff members who had shown subtle signs of support. "I heard about the parent email," Ms. Harper said, her voice low. "Are you okay?" Aaliyah sighed. "I'm managing. But it's obvious where this is coming from." Ms. Harper nodded. "You're not wrong. He's been vocal about you to certain parents. It's disgusting. Why hasn't anyone said anything?" Aaliyah asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. Ms. Harper hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "We're scared. He's vindictive, and he's already picked you as his target. If anyone speaks up, we're next." The admission stung, but it also confirmed what Aaliyah already knew. She was on her own. That evening, she began researching the district's leadership. A name stood out to her: James Carter, the superintendent. He was black, and his bio highlighted his focus on diversity and inclusion in education. Aaliyah hesitated. She didn't know much about him and wasn't sure how far his commitment to these values extended. But she was running out of options. The next morning, she sent an email to his office, requesting a meeting. She kept it brief, mentioning concerns about workplace conduct, without going into detail. To her surprise, his assistant responded quickly, scheduling a meeting for the following week. As the days passed, Richard's behavior grew more brazen. He began openly criticizing her in the staff room, suggesting that her classroom's discipline issues reflected her lack of competence. "Some people just don't have what it takes," he said one afternoon, his eyes locking with hers. "It's not their fault, really. You can't expect everyone to rise to the challenge." The other teachers averted their gazes, their silence deafening. When the day of her meeting with James Carter arrived, Aaliyah felt a mix of hope and anxiety. She entered his office, clutching a folder containing her observations and notes. "Ms. Daniels," he said warmly, standing to shake her hand. "Thank you for reaching out. Please, have a seat." Aaliyah quickly realized that James was different. He listened intently as she outlined the situation, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "This is deeply concerning," he said when she finished, "but without concrete evidence, it will be difficult to take immediate action. Do you have anything documented?" Aaliyah's heart sank. "Not yet," she admitted, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to gather proof." James leaned forward, his voice firm but encouraging. "This is unacceptable, and I want you to know you're not alone in this. If you can document his behavior, I'll ensure it's addressed appropriately." For the first time in weeks, Aaliyah felt a glimmer of hope. She left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to expose Richard for who he truly was. That evening, she purchased a small recording device and practiced using it. The next step would be the hardest, baiting Richard into revealing the full extent of his racism while protecting herself in the process. As she prepared for the days ahead, she reminded herself of something James had said. People like him thrive on silence. The moment you speak up, you take away their power. The hallway buzzed with the chatter of students heading to their next classes, but Aaliyah Daniels was in no mood to soak in the energy. Her focus was singular, navigating the minefield Richard Kavanaugh had turned her workplace into. Her new recording device sat discreetly in the inner pocket of her blazer, its small red light concealed by fabric. She had spent the night practicing scenarios in her head, determined to capture evidence of Richard's behavior without incriminating herself in the process. Her first opportunity came during a routine faculty meeting. Richard stood at the front of the room, outlining changes to the semester schedule. As always, he peppered his comments with casual digs, thinly veiled under the guise of policy updates. "We need to ensure the quality of education remains consistent across the board," he said, his eyes flicking toward Aaliyah. "Some of our students have been voicing concerns about how prepared they feel for state testing, and it's our job to address those gaps, especially in certain classrooms." Aaliyah felt the heat rise in her face, but kept her expression neutral. She glanced around the room, noting the tense silence from her colleagues. "Ms. Daniels," Richard continued, his tone sharp, "how are you handling the new class roster? It must be quite an adjustment for you." "It's a challenge, but I'm managing," she replied evenly. Richard's smile was tight and condescending. "Good to hear. I'd hate for any missteps to reflect poorly on the school's reputation." The recording device captured every word. Aaliyah's hands trembled under the table, but she maintained her composure, knowing she couldn't afford to falter now. Later that day, she passed Mr. Larson in the hallway. The veteran teacher avoided her gaze, a guilty flush creeping up his neck. Aaliyah felt a pang of frustration. His silence, like that of so many others, was a tacit endorsement of Richard's actions. As the week progressed, Richard's provocations escalated. He began stopping by her classroom unannounced, standing in the back, and jotting down notes on a clipboard. The students, already unsettled by their challenging circumstances, grew more agitated under his scrutiny. One afternoon, Richard lingered after the students had left. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as Aaliyah tidied the desks. "You've got your hands full, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "It's almost like you're not cut out for this kind of environment." Aaliyah turned to face him, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, come on," he replied with a smirk. "You know exactly what I mean. It takes a certain skill set to manage these kinds of students. Not everyone has it." She held his gaze, her mind racing. "I believe all students deserve the same opportunities, regardless of their challenges." "That's cute," Richard said, stepping closer. "But let's be honest. Some students, just like some teachers, don't belong in certain environments. It's not personal, Ms. Daniels. It's just the way the world works. Her hand brushed the pocket of her blazer, ensuring the device was still in place. That's your opinion, she said quietly. But it's not mine. Richard's expression darkened. You're lucky to even have a job here, Ms. Daniels. I suggest you remember that before you start throwing around accusations or stepping out of line. This isn't the kind of school where people like you get to make the rules. Aaliyah's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain calm. Are we done here? For now, he said, his smirk returning. But don't get too comfortable. You might find that this job isn't as secure as you think. As he walked away, Aaliyah exhaled shakily, her fingers brushing against the recording device. She had captured everything, but the weight of his words lingered. That evening she reviewed the audio, her resolve hardening with each replay. His tone, his words. There was no mistaking the malice behind them. She thought about her conversation with Superintendent James Carter and the assurance he had given her. People like Richard thrived on fear and silence. But Aaliyah was done being silent. The following morning, Aaliyah Daniels walked into Glendale High School with the weight of Richard Kavanaugh's threats pressing heavily on her shoulders. She had spent hours replaying the audio recordings, each word sharpening her determination to see justice served. But her fight wasn't just about her, it was about what Richard represented and the system that allowed him to thrive. As she settled into her classroom, a knock on the door startled her. It was Mr. Larson, the senior teacher who had inherited her advanced students. Aaliyah, he began hesitantly, stepping inside. Can I have a word? She nodded, motioning to an empty desk. I just wanted to apologize, he said, avoiding her gaze. I know how unfair this situation is, but I've got a family to think about. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. So, you're saying nothing because you're afraid of retaliation? Larson sighed. It's not just me. Everyone's scared of him. He's ruthless, Aaliyah. Look, I respect what you're doing, but you need to be careful. He's already spreading rumors about you to parents. He's trying to build a case. Her stomach churned. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her anger flare. Thanks for letting me know, she said curtly, her tone signaling the conversation was over. Larson left, his shoulders slumped, and Aaliyah returned to her desk, staring at the pile of student work. She thought of the kids in her classroom, many of whom carried burdens far greater than she ever had at their age. Richard's actions weren't just sabotaging her career, they were jeopardizing their futures. Later that day, as Aaliyah passed through the teacher's lounge, she overheard a group of staff members talking in hushed tones. I heard he's moving forward with a formal evaluation of her classroom. One teacher whispered, she'll never pass. He's setting her up to fail. Another replied. Aaliyah's presence silenced the room. The teachers glanced at her with expressions ranging from pity to guilt. But no one said a word. She left without acknowledging them, her resolve hardening further. When she returned to her classroom, she found a note taped to her desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Quit while you still can. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she crumpled the paper. She wasn't sure if it was from Richard or one of his enablers, but it didn't matter. It only strengthened her resolve. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her emails when one caught her attention. It was from a parent of one of her struggling students. Ms. Daniels, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to help my son. He's been through a lot, and your patience means the world to us. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to support you. Tears pricked her eyes. The message was a reminder of why she had chosen this career. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for her students, for their families, and for every teacher who had ever been silenced. The next day, Aaliyah implemented a plan. She began documenting everything: emails, conversations, even Richard's unannounced classroom visits. She compiled student testimonies, careful not to involve them directly, but noting their struggles and comments about the changes. Richard, seemingly emboldened, continued to escalate his attacks. During a staff meeting, he made a thinly veiled remark about teachers who play the victim card when they can't handle the pressure. "You know," he said, glancing at Aaliyah, "some people just aren't meant for this profession. It's not a bad thing, it's just reality." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Aaliyah met his gaze, refusing to look away. The turning point came when one of her students approached her after class. "Miss Daniels," the boy said nervously, "Principal Kavanaugh pulled me into his office. He asked me a lot of weird questions about you. If you're strict, if you yell a lot, stuff like that." Aaliyah's heart sank. Richard was building his case against her, just as Larson had warned. "That's okay," she said gently, kneeling to meet the student's eyes. "Thank you for telling me. You're not in trouble, okay?" The boy nodded, but the encounter left her shaken. Richard was relentless, and his influence over the students was dangerous. That evening, Aaliyah met with Superintendent James Carter for the second time. She handed over the recordings and documentation, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "This is serious," James said, his expression grim as he reviewed the evidence. "You've done well to gather this, but the fight isn't over yet. We need a direct confrontation to seal the case against him." Aaliyah nodded, her determination unwavering. She knew the confrontation with Richard would be the most challenging moment yet, but she was ready. The next morning, Aaliyah Daniels walked into her classroom feeling the weight of the battle ahead. Her confrontation with Richard Kavanaugh was inevitable, but the emotional toll was already immense. The note on her desk from the previous day lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder that she was alone in this fight. Her first class was unusually restless. Two students argued loudly over a misplaced backpack, and another refused to engage, slouching with earbuds tucked beneath his hoodie. Aaliyah moved between the desks, her patience stretched thin, offering quiet encouragement to those struggling. After class, she sat at her desk, exhaling deeply. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was the emotional strain of being under constant scrutiny. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Richard, clipboard in hand, and a smug expression plastered across his face. "Walk with me," he said, not waiting for her response. Reluctantly, Aaliyah followed him into the hallway, where he stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "I've been reviewing your recent evaluations," he began, his tone laced with mock concern. "It seems there are recurring issues in your classroom. Disruptive behavior, low engagement. Should I go on?" Aaliyah met his gaze, her heart pounding. She knew the recordings in her possession painted a very different picture, but the sting of his accusations still hit hard. "I'm doing the best I can with the students I've been assigned," she replied firmly. "Their challenges don't define their potential, and I'm committed to helping them succeed." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Spoken like someone who's not cut out for this job. Let's be honest, Ms. Daniels. You're in over your head. This isn't some inner-city school where you can get by with mediocrity." Aaliyah's breath caught. The casual racism in his words was sharp, deliberate. "Are you insinuating that my qualifications or methods are inadequate because of where you think I come from?" He smirked. "I'm just saying, not everyone fits in here. You should consider whether Glendale High is the right environment for someone like you." The hallway felt suffocating. Aaliyah wanted to scream, to unleash the frustration building inside her, but she knew she couldn't risk losing control. Instead, she straightened her posture. "I'll let my work speak for itself." Richard's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Do that, but don't be surprised when the board decides you're not the right fit. This place deserves better." That evening, Aaliyah replayed the conversation on her recorder, her stomach knotting at the venom in his voice. Each word stoked the fire of her determination, but it also left her questioning how far she could push herself. She called her sister, Amara, for support. "I'm so tired," Aaliyah admitted, her voice trembling. "It's like nothing I do matters. He's already decided I don't belong here." "You belong there just as much as anyone else," Amara replied firmly. "He's trying to break you because he knows you're stronger than him." Don't give him the satisfaction. Aaliyah closed her eyes, drawing strength from her sister's words. It's just so hard, Amara. Every day, it feels like I'm walking into a battlefield. That's because you are, Amara said. But you're not alone. You've got your students, and you've got that superintendent on your side. Focus on what you can control and keep fighting. The next day, Aaliyah approached one of her problem students, Malik, during lunch. He had been a frequent source of disruptions, but also showed glimpses of potential when he let his guard down. "Malik," she said gently, sitting across from him in the nearly empty cafeteria, "can we talk for a minute?" The boy shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I know things have been tough for you," she continued, "but I want you to know I see how hard you're trying. You're smarter than you give yourself credit for." Malik glanced at her, his guarded expression softening slightly. "Yeah, well, not everyone thinks that. Some people just see trouble." Aaliyah's heart ached at his words. She knew all too well the weight of being judged unfairly. What other people think doesn't matter as much as what you believe about yourself. You have so much potential, Malik. Don't let anyone take that from you. He nodded slowly, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. As she returned to her classroom, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her students were worth the fight. That afternoon, Richard summoned her to his office once again. This time, his tone was colder, more calculating. "I've received complaints from several parents about your performance," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "They're concerned about your ability to manage your classroom effectively." Aaliyah flipped through the papers, her stomach twisting as she read the fabricated allegations. "I'll be submitting these to the board," Richard added, his tone triumphant. "You've got a week to turn things around." But I wouldn't hold my breath. She stood, her hands trembling. "You can send whatever you want to the board, but I've been documenting everything. You're not going to get away with this." Richard's expression darkened. "Is that a threat, Ms. Daniels?" "It's a promise," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. As she left his office, Aaliyah felt the weight of the battle ahead. But she also felt something else, hope. She was closer than ever to exposing the truth. Aaliyah Daniels arrived at school early the next morning, her mind racing with everything Richard had thrown at her. His threat to escalate fabricated complaints to the board had been his boldest move yet, but Aaliyah was prepared. The recordings she had collected so far painted a damning picture, but she knew she needed more. Her students trickled into the classroom, their chatter a temporary reprieve from the storm brewing around her. Malik, the student she had spoken to the day before, approached her desk hesitantly. "Miss Daniels," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Principal Kavanaugh called me to his office again yesterday." Aaliyah's heart sank. "What did he say?" "He was asking more questions about you. Like if you ever yell at us or treat us unfairly." Malik frowned, his tone serious. "But I told him you don't do any of that. You're like the only teacher who actually listens to us." Aaliyah forced a smile despite the tightness in her chest. "Thank you for being honest, Malik. That means a lot to me." He nodded and returned to his seat. But the encounter left Aaliyah shaken. Richard wasn't just targeting her. He was trying to manipulate her students against her. During lunch, Aaliyah sat in the faculty lounge, going over her notes. The atmosphere was unusually tense, the other teachers casting furtive glances in her direction. She could sense their unease, their silent acknowledgement of the battle raging just beneath the surface. "I heard he's doubling down on the complaints," one teacher whispered to another, not realizing Aaliyah could hear them. "She doesn't stand a chance." Aaliyah closed her notebook, her resolve hardening. If Richard wanted a fight, she would give him one. Later that day, Richard made another surprise visit to her classroom. He stood at the back, arms crossed, his cold gaze scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. The students, already wary of him, grew quieter, their nervous energy palpable. As the lesson ended and the students filed out, Richard approached her desk. "I see you're trying," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But effort isn't always enough, is it?" Aaliyah met his gaze, her voice steady. I've documented every interaction we've had, and I'm confident my work speaks for itself." Richard's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, sharper than ever. "You think documentation is going to save you? People like you always think playing the victim will get them ahead. Newsflash, Ms. Daniels. This isn't some equality seminar. This is the real world." Aaliyah felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to let him see her falter. "The real world values evidence, Mr. Kavanaugh, and I have plenty of it." Richard's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're out of your league. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." As he left the room, Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the pocket where her recording device rested. She had captured every word. That evening, Aaliyah met with Superintendent James Carter once again. She played the latest recordings for him, her heart pounding as Richard's venomous words filled the air. James leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and resolve. "This is more than enough to move forward," he said firmly. "We'll call a disciplinary hearing immediately. But I need you to be ready. He's going to fight back, and it won't be pretty." "I'm ready," Aaliyah replied, her voice unwavering. James nodded. "Good, because this isn't just about you. It's about setting a precedent for what we will and won't tolerate in this district." The next day, Aaliyah received an email from James's office. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following week. The notice included a list of attendees, and Richard's name sat boldly at the top. The anticipation weighed heavily on Aaliyah. She spent her evenings preparing, reviewing her recordings and notes, rehearsing how she would present her case. But despite her determination, doubt crept in. What if Richard found a way to twist the narrative? What if no one believed her? Her sister, Amara, called to check on her. "You've got this," she said confidently. "You've already done the hard part. Now it's about letting the truth speak for itself." Aaliyah nodded, even though Amara couldn't see her. "I just want this to be over. I want him gone." "And he will be," Amara assured her. "He's already losing. That's why he's coming at you so hard. Keep going." The week leading up to the hearing was a whirlwind. Richard's behavior became more erratic, his comments sharper, his glares more pointed. But Aaliyah stood her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. By the time the day of the hearing arrived, the tension at Glendale High was palpable. Teachers whispered in the hallways, students sensed the shift in the air, and even Richard seemed less sure of himself. Aaliyah walked into the meeting room with her head held high, her recordings and documentation in hand. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The disciplinary hearing was held in the sterile conference room of the district office. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the long table where Aaliyah Daniels sat, her documents and recordings laid out before her. Across from her sat Richard Kavanaugh, his face impassive, but his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished wood. Superintendent James Carter sat at the head of the table, flanked by a district HR representative and 2 board members. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice calm yet authoritative. "We're here to address serious allegations against Principal Richard Kavanaugh regarding his conduct toward Ms. Aaliyah Daniels." Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk barely concealed. "Allegations? I wasn't informed this was going to be a witch hunt, but I'm happy to set the record straight." James's expression remained neutral. "This is a fact-finding hearing, Mr. Kavanaugh, not a witch hunt. Ms. Daniels, you may begin." Aaliyah swallowed hard and began recounting her experiences, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. She described the first day Richard arrived, his thinly veiled racist remarks, the redistribution of students, and the escalating hostility in his behavior. "From the beginning," she said, her tone firm, "Mr. Kavanaugh made it clear that he did not see me as an equal member of the staff. He undermined my authority with my students, reassigned advanced classes to other teachers, and openly suggested that I was unfit for my role because of my background." Richard snorted, shaking his head. "This is absurd. Ms. Daniels is clearly misinterpreting my efforts to support her. I've given her every opportunity to succeed, despite her Challenges. James raised a hand. You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Kavanaugh. Please let Ms. Daniels finish. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed play on her recording device. Richard's voice echoed through the room. Let's be honest, Ms. Daniels. You're in over your head. This isn't some inner-city school where you can get by with mediocrity. The room fell silent. The HR representative stopped taking notes, her pen hovering mid-air. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with James. Aaliyah paused the recording. That's just one example of the rhetoric I've endured. There's more. She played another clip. People like you always think playing the victim will get them ahead. Newsflash, Ms. Daniels. This isn't some equality seminar. This is the real world. Richard's face darkened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. This is ridiculous. You're twisting my words completely out of context. James's voice cut through the tension. Then, explain the context, Mr. Kavanaugh. What exactly were you trying to convey? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. He glanced at the board members, his usual confidence faltering. I was addressing concerns about her classroom management. That's my job as principal, to ensure standards are met. Standards? Aaliyah asked, her voice sharp. By insinuating that I don't belong here because of my race? By undermining me in front of my students and colleagues? How is that meeting any standard? Richard shot her a glare. You're clearly taking this personally, Ms. Daniels. Perhaps you should consider whether you're cut out for this profession. Enough, James interjected, his tone firm. He turned to the HR representative. Are these statements consistent with professional conduct? The representative shook her head. Not in the slightest. This is grossly inappropriate language for any workplace, let alone a school. During a recess, Aaliyah stepped into the hallway, her chest heaving from the adrenaline coursing through her. She hadn't realized how much it would take to confront Richard face to face, but she felt vindicated, knowing the evidence was irrefutable. As she leaned against the wall, Malik appeared, shifting nervously on his feet. Miss Daniels, he began, his voice quiet. I heard about the meeting. I wanted to come. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. Malik, you didn't have to. I wanted to, he interrupted, meeting her gaze. You've always been there for us, even when no one else was. I figured it's only right to be here for you. Aaliyah felt a lump rise in her throat. Thank you, Malik. That means more to me than you know. The teenager nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. You're gonna win, Miss Daniels. I know you will. When the hearing resumed, Richard attempted a different approach. He leaned forward, his tone shifting to one of exaggerated sincerity. This has been an incredibly challenging time for me, he began, his eyes darting between the board members. I've worked tirelessly to improve this school, to support my staff, and to provide the best education for our students. If Ms. Daniels felt unsupported, I regret that. But it was never my intention to make her feel unwelcome. James's expression remained unreadable. Do you believe the comments in the recordings reflect a supportive attitude? Well, no, Richard admitted, his voice strained. But those comments were made in frustration. Ms. Daniels has struggled to manage her students effectively, and as principal, I have to address those issues. Perhaps I was too direct. Too direct? Aaliyah repeated, her voice rising. You threatened my career. You told me no one would believe me because of my race. That's not being direct. It's harassment. Richard's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. I think Ms. Daniels is exaggerating her interpretation of events. She seems determined to paint me as the villain here. You don't need to be painted as the villain, James said, his tone cutting. Your words speak for themselves. As the meeting wrapped up, James addressed the room. The evidence presented today is deeply troubling, he said. Ms. Daniels has demonstrated remarkable professionalism and resilience in the face of unacceptable behavior. Mr. Kavanaugh, your conduct is not only inappropriate, but a violation of district policy. The board will deliberate on the appropriate consequences, but I can tell you now that this behavior will not be tolerated. Richard's face turned crimson. This is outrageous. I've been a principal for decades. You can't take her word over mine. We're not taking her word, James said firmly. We're taking the evidence. Outside the district office, Aaliyah leaned against her car, the cool evening air washing over her. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, her body still humming with the tension of the hearing. Miss Daniels! Malik's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see him jogging toward her, a wide grin on his face. Told you you'd win, he said, his excitement infectious. Aaliyah laughed softly, shaking her head. It's not over yet, Malik. But thank you. I couldn't have done this without you. He shrugged. You've done more for us than anyone else. It's about time someone stood up for you. That evening, an email arrived from James Carter. The board had reached its decision. Richard Kavanaugh was to be terminated, effective immediately. His office would be cleared out by the end of the week. As Aaliyah read the words, a wave of emotion washed over her. She had fought, and she had won. But more importantly, she had proven that resilience and truth could triumph over prejudice. The news of Richard Kavanaugh's impending termination spread through Glendale High School like wildfire. By mid-morning, whispers filled the hallways, and Aaliyah Daniels found herself the reluctant center of attention. For weeks, she had been the target of Richard's malice, but now the power dynamic had shifted. Despite the victory in the hearing, Richard hadn't left yet. His final day loomed, and his presence was an ever-present storm cloud over the school. Aaliyah steeled herself for whatever came next, knowing he wasn't the type to bow out gracefully. In the staff lounge, Aaliyah overheard snippets of conversations between her colleagues. Did you hear? He's clearing out his office. About time. I still can't believe he lasted this long. I just hope this means things will get better around here. Their words weren't directed at her, but Aaliyah felt their weight. Many of her colleagues had remained silent during her ordeal, and their sudden outspokenness felt hollow. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Mr. Larson approached, his expression sheepish. Aaliyah, he began awkwardly, I wanted to say, I'm sorry for not standing up for you earlier. I should have done more. She studied him for a moment, weighing her response. You had the chance to speak up, and you didn't, she said evenly. But if you're serious about making this school a better place, you can start by doing what's right moving forward. Larson nodded, his face reddening. I'll do better. I promise. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah returned to her classroom to find a student waiting for her. It was Malik again, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. Miss Daniels, he said, shuffling his feet, I, overheard something in the hallway. What is it? Aaliyah asked, setting down her bag. Kavanaugh's mad, Malik said, his voice low. He was talking to some other teachers about how this isn't over. He said something about making sure you regret this. Aaliyah's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression calm. Thank you for telling me, Malik. I'll handle it. You sure? I can stay if you want. She smiled at his offer, touched by his loyalty. I'll be fine. Go enjoy your afternoon. As the day wound down, Aaliyah stayed late to organize her classroom. The school was eerily quiet, most of the staff and students having already gone home. She was packing up when the door opened abruptly, and Richard stepped inside. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to show fear. Mr. Kavanaugh, she said, her tone neutral. Is there something you need? He shut the door behind him, his expression cold. You think you've won, don't you? Aaliyah set her bag down, standing her ground. The board made their decision. It's over. Over, Richard scoffed, his laugh bitter. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined my career, my reputation. All because you couldn't handle a little pressure. This wasn't about pressure, Aaliyah replied, her voice steady. This was about accountability. Your behavior was unacceptable, and you know it. Richard took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. You don't belong here. You never did. This school, this district, it was fine before you showed up, stirring the pot with your victim complex. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she held her ground. The only thing I've done is stand up for myself and my students. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem. "You think you're so righteous," he sneered, "but you're just a token, a diversity hire. And the minute you step out of line, they'll drop you too." The words cut deep, but Aaliyah refused to let him see her pain. "You can say whatever you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you're leaving. Your time here is over." Richard's face twisted with fury. For a moment, Aaliyah thought he might lash out physically, but he stopped himself, taking a deep breath. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "You'll regret this. Mark my words." Without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Shaken but resolute, Aaliyah sank into her desk chair, her mind racing. She replayed the encounter in her head, the venom in Richard's words echoing like a warning. But she reminded herself that she had done everything right. She had gathered evidence, stood her ground, and refused to be silenced. Her phone buzzed with a message from James Carter. "Good news. The termination paperwork is finalized. Kavanaugh's last day is tomorrow. Let me know if you experience any further issues." Aaliyah stared at the screen, her emotions a whirlwind of relief and exhaustion. The fight was almost over, but Richard's parting words lingered in her mind. As she left the school that evening, the halls felt different. Lighter, freer. She knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. The next day marked Richard Kavanaugh's final hours at Glendale High. Word of his dismissal had spread to students and parents, fueling whispered conversations and speculation throughout the school. But for Aaliyah Daniels, the day carried a mixture of relief and dread. Richard's parting threat echoed in her mind, refusing to let her fully celebrate the victory. As Aaliyah prepared for her first class, a student burst into her room, wide-eyed and frantic. "Miss Daniels, you need to come to the office. Something's happening with Mr. Kavanaugh," the student said. Her heart pounded as she followed the student to the main office, where a small crowd of teachers and staff had gathered. Richard stood in the center of the room, his face flushed with anger as he shouted at James Carter, who remained composed but firm. "This is ridiculous," Richard bellowed, gesturing wildly. "You're all cowards for letting her do this to me. That woman ruined everything." Aaliyah stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. She could feel every eye turn toward her as Richard's gaze locked onto hers. "There she is," he snarled, pointing a finger at her. "The destroyer of careers. I hope you're happy, Ms. Daniels, because you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." James stepped between them, his voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Kavanaugh, you're no longer an employee of this district. You need to leave the premises immediately, or I'll be forced to call security." Richard laughed bitterly. "Call security? Go ahead. This whole place is a joke. You think getting rid of me will fix anything? She's the problem." Aaliyah straightened her shoulders, taking a step forward. "The only problem here was you, Mr. Kavanaugh. Your behavior was unprofessional, harmful, and rooted in prejudice. That's why you're being held accountable." Richard's face turned crimson, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you've won, but you're just a puppet. They'll drop you the moment you stop being useful. Mark my words. You'll regret this." "Enough," James said sharply. "Mr. Kavanaugh, leave now, or I'll have you escorted out." Security arrived moments later, guiding Richard out as he hurled one final barrage of insults. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves, while Aaliyah remained rooted in place, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. James approached her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I am now. Thank you for stepping in." "You handled yourself well," James said. "Not everyone could have stood up to him the way you did." Later that day, Aaliyah returned to her classroom to find a note on her desk. For a moment, her stomach tightened, fearing another threat. But as she unfolded the paper, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for not giving up on us. You're the best teacher I've ever had." The simple message brought a wave of emotion that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. Despite everything, she had made an impact. Her fight hadn't been in vain. The days following Richard's departure brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Glendale High. Staff meetings felt less tense, students were more relaxed, and Aaliyah no longer felt like she was walking into a war zone every morning. One afternoon, she received a call from James Carter's office. "Aaliyah," James said warmly, "I wanted to follow up on everything. How are you feeling?" "Better," she admitted. "It's been a relief not having to look over my shoulder every day." "I'm glad to hear that," James said. "I also wanted to share some good news. The board was so impressed by your courage and professionalism that they've approved a new mentorship program for minority teachers in the district. I'd like you to consider leading it." Aaliyah's breath caught. "Me? Lead the program? You're the perfect candidate," James said. "You've already proven you have the resilience and leadership we need. It's a way to ensure no one else has to go through what you did." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you. I'd be honored." The following week, as Aaliyah walked through the halls, she noticed the subtle changes in her students' demeanor. Malik and a group of his peers were laughing together near her classroom, their confidence growing with each passing day. "Miss Daniels," Malik called, waving her over, "we were just talking about your class. Are we doing more of that poetry stuff tomorrow?" She smiled, her heart full. "You'll have to wait and see. But yes, we're continuing with poetry." The bell rang, and the students filed into her room, their energy infectious. As Aaliyah began her lesson, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle with Richard had been grueling, but it had also solidified her resolve to fight for what was right, for herself, her students, and the teachers who would come after her. Her voice carried confidently as she read aloud from the poem they were studying, the words resonating in the quiet room. "Still I rise." The students listened intently, their eyes fixed on her, and for the first time in a long while, Aaliyah felt truly at peace.